For 40 years, NATO and Soviet naval forces patrolled the world's oceans. This week on the Aviation Show, brought to you as always by the fab Pima Air and Space Museum in Tucson, Arizona, retired tornado driver and author Michael Napier joins us to discuss his latest book, Over Cold War Seas, which looks at the 4-decade duel for control of the world's sea lanes and the aircraft that flew above them, looking for what lurked above and below the waves. Of course, the fabulous Pima Air and Space Museum in Tucson, Arizona has most of the aircraft that we're going to talk about on display, so be sure to check them out. Please do give us a like and subscribe, and without further ado, we're going to get straight into our chat with Mike to find out more about Over Cold War Seas. Mike, so good to see you again. This is nuts. It's been years since we had you on to do your book on the Korean Air War, which is great. It's on the shelves here and things. How have you been, sir?
Busy is the answer. Yeah, that was good a few years ago. And a few other books have passed under the bridge, as they say, somewhere, to mix my metaphors. Yeah. One of which we're going to talk about now, I guess. But yes, it's been a busy and productive time, shall we say. But,
super. Well, welcome back. Thank you for being patient for me to reach out and get you back, because this one's sort of sequel, isn't it? Because you did In Cold War Skies, which was sort of NATO land-basedy stuff. Now you've gone all boaty on us for Over Cold War Seas, haven't you? Well,
the idea, obviously, and I have to admit here that the idea of neither was mine. A guy called Jasper Spencer Smith, who's my sort of editor, ideas man, had come up with, and the idea had always been to do it as a two-parter, really because just the amount or volume of material and data and everything else. So the idea was always to do it in two. And in fact, it's quite funny because some of the reviews of Cold War Sky said, he's missed out all the naval stuff, which I'd actually written in the introduction. This is part one. so that's how I got into it, really. Having done the first one, we, some years later, have got around to doing the sequel, as it were, which indeed covers the naval and maritime side of things.
And I found it really interesting because, as we were talking before, there's this interesting sort of dichotomy between, we're going to go into this in a minute, but of the buildup of air power at sea in NATO versus naval projection from land from the Soviet side. And it seems an imbalance, but we're gonna talk about that because you cover a lot of ground in it. So we're going to sort of start creation of NATO, 1949, really. And I find this period fascinating because it's the victorious Western powers, if we think USA, Canada, why not? We'll put Canada in this. There we go. Canada, Britain, France is rearming as well. They're all still have large carrier fleets. We've got the jet transition going on. But the cash is starting to change a bit, isn't it? So what is the state of naval aviation at the birth of NATO when we start looking at this, and then the Soviets as well, who are bringing a completely different viewpoint to it?
Well, do you know what? It's probably, if I answer the first bit of the question you said you come to later first, because it kind of explains, it sets or sets the scene a bit better. But in that, if you look at the classic map of the world that we see with the Greenwich Meridian down the middle of it, and on the left you've got the USA and the Americas, shall we say, because I won't forget Canada and please help me. And on the right you've got Europe, then becoming Asia. And most of Asia is covered at the top by Russia, the Soviet Union. And so the Soviet Union was very much, and indeed the Warsaw Pact, a land force, because it had land borders with pretty much everything that mattered. In terms of naval thing, it didn't really have an awful lot, but no particular need to. But there again, there's the port water up in the north of Murmansk, access to the Baltic through St. Petersburg, Leningrad, St. Petersburg again, and through the Mediterranean, but that had to be via the Black Sea through Crimea, and then over in Vladivostok into the Pacific. So very, very limited access to the sea, but its sphere of influence really was overland. Dominating as it did Asia and Eastern Europe. If you look at the left-hand side of the map then, or the western side of it, there's a big blue hole in the middle of it, and the clue really is the North Atlantic treaty organisation. So, we and indeed the powers of Western Europe, which you've already mentioned in terms of the French, but also the Dutch. And then on the other side of the Atlantic, the Canadians and the Americans were very much sort of maritime minded. And one of the critical points in World War II, which didn't affect the Russians, well, you could argue it didn't affect, but certainly affected us, was the lifeline across the Atlantic. I mean, obviously there were the northern convoys into Murmansk to support the Russians, but they were probably quite small beer in comparison to what was coming across into the UK and later into Europe, and of course into North Africa as well. So the Atlantic and the ability to sail across it safely was very much a fundamental part of NATO, but not really initially a fundamental part of Soviet thinking, because their interest was in what was happening on the land. So that kind of explains why there was such a big difference in at the end of the war as to one side had lots of ships and the other had virtually none, and why the team starting from none with very little access to the water and no need to protect sea lines of communication had a different approach to it all. But yes, you're right. I mean, at the end of the war, lots of carriers, lots of airplanes, actually probably all being mothballed, really. And certainly in 1949, when NATO starts, the US have got most of their carriers in mothballs. Some are being refitted. There are a couple of them out in the Pacific. I think a couple of them, because of course there were always two fleets, because the America looked both ways, both out of the Pacific and at the Atlantic. Similarly, the British carrier force, the Royal Navy, Royal Navy was contracting rapidly, really, as you mentioned, because of a shortage of cash. The Dutch had a carrier, and the Canadians also had one, but again, small forces. And as you say, we start off with propeller airplanes, and we're into the beginning of the jet age, bringing with it faster airplanes, which then you have a problem with, because then how are you going to get them off? You need a catapult, you need arrestor gear to land them, whereas a propeller airplane, you don't necessarily need either of those things. And you also need the ability to, because using the arrestor gear, to be able to store the airplanes out of the way so that you can use the back end of the deck for landing on. And the solution to that was a great British idea, but like with many things, the Brits come up with the idea, but the Americans actually make it happen. The angled deck, which sort of changed things. So now you've got the jet airplanes, high performance airplanes that you can launch off carriers and recover them almost independently. That's really where we are. The Americans, again, have started flying jet airplanes off carriers much earlier than the Brits, who are kind of the second. I mean, at that stage, the Royal Navy is the second largest navy in the world still. But we go to Korea, and Korea was really the turning point for the carrier, I think, in many ways in the modern sort of in the Cold War. In that suddenly there was a need to get all these carriers out of storage and into action. So they all rushed into action. So suddenly, from having not many carriers, the US Navy's got loads, and they're operating off Korea, as are the few British ones as well, which get shoved out there. And again, that's the first time that carriers get used as kind of offshore floating airfields, where you drive a couple of ships up, and you suddenly now got 100, 150 airplanes that can get off there. Now, I'm just going to go back a stage now into World War II, which is the other thing, which is the US Navy and the Royal Navy both had kind of very different experiences of war. In that, the US Navy was very much focused on the Pacific. And in the Pacific, they were fighting an enemy that had lots of aircraft carriers, lots of big ships, and not many submarines. And they were fighting that while they were carrying out sort of an amphibious assault across the various islands of the Pacific. So that sort of came up with that. That's where the idea of the carrier strike group comes into play, and where that kind of gets refined in a way in Korea. You pitch up with loads of carriers, loads of airplanes, take names and kick ass offshore somewhere, basically using the carriers as floating airfields. On the other hand, the Royal Navy was very much focused on the Atlantic and the sea lines of communication. And they were up against an enemy which had no aircraft carriers, had very few capital ships, but had loads and loads of submarines. And so their focus is now on anti-submarine warfare. And that's the case all with the Royal Canadian Navy and also the Royal Dutch Navy as well. So the sort of Canadian, British and European experience, if you like, of naval warfare is out of very much of anti-submarine warfare. And so there's a kind of bit of a disconnect between where the US Navy is going and where the Royal Navy and kind of the NATO fleets, if you like, are going. But again, I point to Korea as the point where, firstly, this idea of the carrier strike group sort of first came into its own. But also that's the time when jet aircraft come into their own, and they start off with straight-winged aircraft. I think in the Panther and I'm looking down here and the Banshee. So, and at the same time, the Royal Navy goes into action in Korea, and we've got Fireflies, Seafires initially, and Seafuries. And then by the time we get into the straight-winged aircraft, initially the Attacker, and then we get into Sea Venom and Seahawk, as they come into service, the Americans have already moved on from that. They're now into swept-wing aircraft. So we've got Cougars, we've got Cutlasses, good Lord, Skyrays, and all those sort of, all those aircraft.
The Skyrays, that one with that ridiculous wing shape, isn't it?
Yes. But apparently a very effective airplane, bizarrely. Which
people love it. If I say something bad about it in the comments section, it will go wild.
Yes.
But it's a very funny-looking airplane.
It is. But if I have to make an admission here, which I'll do before people point it out when they look at the book, which is one of the chapter openers, is very obviously a Skyray, an F4D, doing an approach onto a carrier. But the caption says something else. It says it's an A4 Skyhawk, and that's because
I wasn't going to mention that, Mike.
Well, I asked for a picture to be changed, which it was, but I thought, therefore, they changed the caption with it as well, but they didn't. So the old caption is still there. So I do know that it's wrong, and yes, it's my fault perhaps for not double checking. But yes, I'll point that out to you before they point it out to you and me. But yes, so we've got all these airplanes, and the Royal Navy really is playing catch up. The Canadian Navy, again, Banshees, straight wing airplanes, and the Dutch have got Seahawks, which take them through to into the 1960s. That's basically kind of sets the scene, I think, as to where we are and why. But I haven't mentioned the Soviets yet, have I? So shall I start doing that as well?
Yeah, because I think you sort of cover quite a bit, and we could get into the
those things. Yes,
we're doing this after a day at the day job, so my brain. Of those types, but I think we'll save the deep dive into the aircraft for some of the interestinger stuff that comes in a minute, because it's very that sort of Gen 1, Gen 2 issues with these types. But like you said, the Soviets, as you said, land focused, and from their experience during the last war as well, very much army forward, artillery forward, armor forward. How do they start to try to counter this buildup? Because I think the key element there is we start talking submarines, which
yes. So what they do
is my other favorite thing in the world. Is
so Admiral Gorshkov, who's in charge of the Navy at the end of the war, has got this idea that he wants a blue water Navy. He wants big ships and all that good stuff. And so they start this program where they're going to build a battleship and they're going to build lots of destroyers and stuff, which they start doing. But while he's doing that, he's also looking at, well, what we're going to use it for. What's the threat? And he identifies that the threat is, or the winning strategy is to sever the sea lines of communication across the Atlantic. So much exactly as the U-boats tried to do back in World War II. That he thinks is NATO's Achilles heel, and so that's what he's going to go after. So he starts on the way, and submarines obviously are a really good way of doing this. So he learns from the Germans. So they go submarines, but they also start building cruisers and destroyers and the rest of it to generate this blue water navy, which they're going to have, and this carries on, and of course that they like the USA. They've got two areas. They're also looking at the Pacific as well. And I haven't really dealt with the Pacific because that kind of sits without the NATO bailiwick, if you like. And I'm looking really at the NATO side of things. So this is how we get into the submarines, and we realise this is the best way to interfere with the sea lines of communication. Of course, the corollary is that, firstly, that NATO identify it as a weakness as well. So, funny old thing, they're hugely into anti-submarine warfare with British carriers to an extent, although the British were also trying to be dealing with the end of the empire, so the carriers are quite often operating in the Far East and the Middle East. But the United States has also got its Atlantic fleet, and also the Mediterranean. So the USA is pretty much split 50-50 between the Pacific on one side and the Atlantic/Med on the other. So there'll always be a carrier in the Mediterranean. There'll always be a couple of carriers in the Atlantic around and about. And they also have now got not only this interest in being carrier strike groups, but also in anti-submarine warfare. But also the strike groups have a key role, which is to go up and defend the northern flank of NATO up in northern Norway, where there's not an awful lot, and where, of course, it's not very far from Russia to get in there. So, the idea is that we can stop the Russians from pouring over the Norwegian border and taking control of the northern Cape. And so, Kuznetsov. Well, first of all, he gets sacked by Stalin because he upsets him, but then in 1951 he gets invited back again, and so carries on. But then when Khrushchev takes over, he gets the sack again, and the new guy, Gorshkov, takes over. And Gorshkov thinks that the sea lines of communication are perhaps not the best way to go. He thinks that actually they need to target the US carriers, or shall we say the NATO carriers, but clearly mainly the American ones, and particularly as NATO is now operating in these big carrier strike groups, where there will be, the Canadian carrier will be part of it, or the Dutch one, or the Brit one, along with the American one. So they are now interested in taking out the carrier strike groups, and the way of doing this again is a submarine. But not only that. And also, if we go back a stage into finding the sea lines of communication, we have to locate the ships and the convoys. So how do we do that? Well, what we'll do is we'll send airplanes, long-range airplanes. So this is where we get into the Badger and the Bear, two airplanes which sort of then go through the entire Cold War, actually, in role. And their job in the Navy, at least, is mainly that of reconnaissance, of locating convoys, of locating the carrier groups, and then vectoring the submarines who are going to take the killing shots against these things, because the Soviets realised that a huge great carrier strike group is going to be very well defended. It's going to have lots of airplanes. It's going to have lots of anti-aircraft ships and God knows what else, and they're going to lose a lot of airplanes if they try and take it out just by air. So their aim is to go in with submarines. And this is where things like Bear come in, Bear Delta particularly, which has got a dual mode of both locating the target, but then and then communicating the target position back to the submarine, which is going to launch the weapon, but then communicating to the weapon halfway through, giving a mid-course update to actually guide it into the terminal phases. So that's the way the Soviets have gone. They think, well, we don't need. We don't need aircraft carriers. We just need long-range airplanes with big radars on that can hunt things down, and then we'll let submarines come in and do the dirty work. Or we've got missile-equipped cruisers that can also do the same thing, stand off and lob huge, great missiles into the fray. So that's where we end up again with the Soviet Navy, with some surface action groups, destroyers and cruisers, with lots of submarines, and with aircraft. Long-range, shore-based maritime patrol aircraft, mainly.
And I think this is where that sort of mix of Soviet submarines starts getting interesting, because everyone's mind immediately goes, Hunt for Red October, the big boomers, things like that. But in these sort of cases, you're thinking the diesel-electric kilos that will be virtually silent when they're sitting there on batteries, waiting for a carrier to come by once they're positioned. They're the ones that are still worried about today in their new models. I don't think they're kilos anymore. They've moved on.
It's only the original kilos. Yeah. That's right. And what I hadn't realised till I started talking to one of my mates who've been on Nimrods and things.
we should point out this is all coming from an RAF man's point of view.
well, that's the point. And I think, I'm a landlubber, and all my experience was overland stuff. But I think, this is what I think it gives me is an unbiased opinion.
I can hear the Navy folks shouting at you. Right
they will be, but it's funny, isn't it? Because people, when someone's being unbiased and you don't agree with what they say, you think, oh, you're biased with the other side. But actually, you're trying to put both sides of the argument over. And again, I've had that with career as well. Somebody dismissing it as the work of I'm thinking of a liberal who knows nothing or something like that. That was the review, which I thought was rather fine. But so again, it was for me to kind of learn all this stuff really from first hand and find out about it, and go, well, that's really really very interesting actually. One of the things, as you say, is a diesel electric boat underwater doesn't make a lot of noise, whereas a nuclear one does, because they've always got to have cooling pumps running. So the pumps make their own signature. So they have quite a distinctive signature. The diesel electrics, not so much. But again, they do have to come up every now and then and vent the batteries and run the diesel. So again, they become very, very vulnerable at that stage once they arrive on the surface. So yeah, there's a sort of pros and cons both ways. And the initial thing, I mean, the initial Russian stuff didn't have much of a range. It could make it from the Manx down to probably the North Sea, and that was it. So actually venturing further into the Atlantic would come later on, sort of in the sort of late 60s, early 70s, that sort of time, really.
So the 50s really are this sort of scene setting for what sort of happens into the 60s, because I think the interesting shift here is you have a very odd time. We've got some periods of massively high tension and then proxy war in Southeast Asia, which you don't particularly cover in the book too much because it's very much a US focused event. But all of that is feeding into development of carriers, but also development of anti-submarine and anti-submarine helicopters, isn't it? Because the helicopter's coming of age, which gives a whole new dynamic to strike fleet protection and also projection for what the helicopter can bring in the 60s.
Well, that's right. I mean, the helicopter suddenly becomes the magic machine, and quite dismissed by many air forces, and particularly European ones. But the Navy see it as a fantastic thing, which it is, because suddenly you don't need, rather than flying a tracker off HMCS Magnificent, you can stick a S-51 or something on the back of a destroyer, and you can do the same. And actually, out in the middle of nowhere, you can be there for hours on end, and you can link it up to the ship sonar. It's a massively flexible machine, and of course, all the European navies say take it on, and as do the Russians actually, the Soviets. Your destroyers and things have all got helicopters as part of the equipment, because they are such a flexible and powerful machine, and that of course then puts out of business quite a lot of the anti-submarine stuff. So, for example, we mentioned the Canadian Navy. Suddenly, it gets too expensive to operate a carrier. And actually, do you really need it anymore? Well, the answer is no, not really. And the same thing with the Dutch as well. It's very expensive. Can we afford it? Well, no. Can we do the job better with something else? Well, yeah, we can. So suddenly we're now into destroyers with helicopters, frigates with helicopters, specialist frigates particularly, and specialist anti-submarine warfare helicopters. And of course, on the later on the carriers, you can stick a load of helicopters on as well, taking up virtually no space and not needing arrested gear or catapults or anything else. So again, a massively flexible and more efficient way, one would say, to wage war against submarines.
Yeah, because the old Bonnie essentially becomes a tracker carrier, doesn't she? She's carrying a small complement of jets, but mostly it's sort of longer range, whatever there were trackers. I should have written that down, but that's what she's doing. She's being able to get those aircraft further out into the Atlantic to do their thing. But like you said, you can much cheaper destroyer with a pad on the back can do exactly the same job. You don't need something as big and beautiful like the Bonnie.
No, you don't. But again, you've got really good long-range maritime patrol aircraft as well to cover it. So the mixture of those two things gives you covering all the bases. And you're right, that was the goodbye, I'm afraid, to the carriers.
Sad day for the Royal Canadian Navy.
Yes.
But then, the RCAF went too whole hog on the Arrow, and then the Navy tried to keep their carrier, and it didn't work out too well for it. I suppose we need to mention sort of NATO long-range maritime aircraft, because this is where we start seeing the introduction of the Orion, which ends up the P3, which serves. I think the Australians have only just retired them, haven't they? So I think they were they were the last. A remarkable aircraft that just does what it says on the tin, doesn't it? Considering it's essentially a built-up Electra. Yeah, is it Electra? Yeah, Electra.
It's Electra. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Yes, indeed. I mean, that's starting off with things like Neptune. I mean, Neptune was used by a lot of obviously the US Navy, but also a lot of the the NATO air forces and NATO navies for the anti-submarine. And then, as you say, the P3 comes in with massive range, massive capacity, puts stuff in it, and a massive capacity there to upgrade it as well. So towards that's why it stays in service for the rest of the Cold War, because you can update it, change the computers, and you've got this fantastically effective bit of kit. The Brits operate Shackleton, which is kind of a bit
a million rivets flying in close formation.
Right. And but the Canadians have the Argus, and some say that's probably one of the finest of all the long range maritime patrol aircraft. It could stay up for a long, long time, and it had loads of stuff in it, loads of kit. So again, a fantastic machine. But as you say, replaced eventually by the P3.
There's been a bit of politics involved in that one as well.
We jumped forward to the Brits with Nimrod. And again, Nimrod, I think, was another very, very capable airplane, and also very quick. Of course, you could go somewhere very fast and then shut a couple of engines down and loiter, and carry all the stuff. And it had very, very effective radar and surveillance equipped on board. So, these very, very capable aircraft. Again, chasing submarines, and with being long range, could cover pretty much everywhere.
Because you called the sort of 60s section of your book "Control of the Seas" by NATO. How complete is that? Because you still have Soviet surface access, getting out and about and things. What do you mean by control of the seas from that perspective? Because it's something that the Soviets worked very, very hard to disrupt moving into the 70s.
Yeah. There are two bits. First of all, on each of the chapters, I tried to find what I thought was a relevant quotation from somebody who was involved in the business. And this was a quote from the 1960s by John F. Kennedy. And he, of course, was an ex-Navy man himself. Yeah, and his point was that the control of the sea is vital for NATO. And so that is what they were shooting for, really, over the Atlantic. And I would argue that, that yes, against a very tough opposition, because the Soviets were very keen to, obviously, to gain it for themselves using the submarine. But as we've already kind of intimated, the way that the NATO navies and I'm saying NATO air forces because I do know the US Navy operates the P3 is not the air, but in some, shall we say, air elements, were able to operate really completely seamlessly. And we have these massive maritime exercises. So I've written some down here actually. There's Northern Wedding, Ocean Safari, Strong Express, Teamwork, which come up where the actual ships, particularly the carrier strike groups, practice working together in a completely sort of multinational group, and therefore are very, very effective at doing that and looking after each other. The NATO anti-submarine ships work together, and the NATO maritime patrol aircraft work seamlessly together. It's all controlled centrally by NATO headquarters. Everything is seamlessly joined together. So, maybe a Norwegian patrol aircraft will note that the submarine's left Murmansk, and that will track it, and that'll be taken over by perhaps an RAF Nimrod, who will then hand it over to a US Navy P3 operating off Keflavik, and then perhaps to a Nimrod if it's going one way, or perhaps across to an Argus stroke P3 from the Canadian side. So these things will be continuously tracked by MPAs, probably also tracked by NATO submarines, but obviously we're into the airborne side of it rather than that, and possibly also tracked by helicopters and an aircraft operating from carriers. So I would say that although there were many Soviet submarines, that I think most of them they reckoned people knew where they were and could neutralise them if possible, and therefore one might argue that NATO did establish control over the sea, particularly over the Atlantic, less so over the North or the Arctic Oceans, which is where the trouble starts later on when Soviet long range submarines start operating there, and now we're talking about not so much hunter killers as the ballistic missile subs, which need to be taken out as well. But certainly in terms of its own backyard and the sea lines of communication, I would argue that the NATO air forces and surface submarine forces work very well together in terms of actually achieving that command of the sea, which was so vital, really, for NATO survival.
The Pima Air and Space Museum in Tucson, Arizona is home to one of the largest non-government funded aviation and space museums in the world. Featuring nearly 400 aircraft, the museum is home to an incredible collection, like NASA's NB-52 X-15 dropship and 747 SP Sophia Airborne Observatory, to a wealth of rare military types from air forces all around the world, to the first production 777. Whether you're a military or civilian aviation geek, there will be an incredible aircraft around every corner of this epic 80-acre site for you to explore. As the Aviation Show's partnership with the Pima Air and Space Museum enters its third year, we're delighted to say that Pima is truly a top of your bucket list museum to visit. And it keeps getting better, as this year the Tucson Military Vehicle Museum will be opening right next door. To find out more about the incredible collection and the fantastic events coming up at the Pima Air and Space Museum, and of course the Tucson Military Vehicle Museum, head over to www.pimaair.org to plan your trip to one of the world's great aviation collections, and one that now includes tanks next door, if that's your sort of thing. Let's talk about the carriers for a second, because it's interesting. In the 60s period, you've got sort of I'm going to get in trouble for this, is you've got the old heavily refined Audacious class British carriers that have sort of come into Eagle and Ark Royal that are constantly being updated. Not particularly big, but you can still get a good complement of F4s on board. You can get a bunch of Buccaneers on them, plus Sea Kings and bits and pieces. The Americans, on the other hand, are going keel up new build carriers for this as well. How are, and of course the French are doing their thing as well. What are the different constraints that the sort of the big three NATO navies are doing here? Because for the British, it seems they're very much trying to keep these things going, because what was it? Eagle was laid down in 1942 or something. I'm looking at my notes. Yeah. And I'm saying Eagle because I used to work with a couple of guys who flew Gannets and Sea Vixens off of Eagle, so I've got a soft spot for her. B.W. Smith has this great old cine film of him sort of stressing around on Eagle, looking great, and then he climbs into a Gannet and everyone starts taking a piss. It's fantastic. But you have, what is the sort of decisions here? Because I'm guessing money is playing a part in it, but you've also got where the focus of each of these navies are.
Well, I think, you're right, money is the focus. Money is it's the root of it all. And the US has lots of it, and we don't. I'm not sure who funded the French ships when they were built, whether it was all French or whether it might have been American money. But certainly I know that, for example, the United States was paying for much of the frontline of the Royal Air Force and much of the frontline aircraft in NATO. So, it was American money that kind of footed the bill for the whole of NATO. But with that money, they could afford to build new carriers, and they could afford to go new ways, use new technology, modernize things, whereas we who didn't have the money were into, mend and make do, shall we say. And, therefore you're stuck with what you've got, and you've got to try and stick it back in. And again, it's a bit like trying to get a quart out of a pint pot. You see things like, Phantom would only fit on Ark Royal because Eagle, the lifts on Eagle weren't big enough, and they couldn't afford the money to refit it. So that's why there was only ever one squadron of naval Phantoms and only one carrier that they were on. And obviously all the limitations. Victorious was even older, I think, than Eagle, and it was that was a genuine wartime ship, which had seen action, I think, in the Med and I think the Far East as well. I think you're now talking about a ship that's 30 odd years old that you're trying to fit things, trying to operate jet aircraft from. So, I think it was perhaps, certainly wasn't the Royal Navy choice. If you remember, they were going to have these two super carriers, CV1 and 2, in the mid-60s. They got cancelled because of money. But on the other hand, and of course the ones who got are constrained because they were built with a view of wartime aircraft. Now we're talking the new needs of jet aircraft. of course, if you build a new one, as the Americans were doing, and particularly get into things like Enterprise, you can build a massive, great big thing that can carry 100, high performance jet aircraft, as opposed to, I mean, you mentioned Dark Royal and say, well, it's got Buccaneers, it had Phantoms, but it only had 12 Bucks, 12 Phantoms, 4 Gannets. So you're talking 30 odd airplanes as opposed to 100. So it's quite a big difference in capability. It really is a massive difference in capability.
Because I guess we're getting to the end of the 60s, and the aircraft are changing rapidly, and in comes possibly the most famous carrier-borne jet fighter of all time in as we get into the 70s and in the Tomcat, because we can't talk about Cold War aircraft without mentioning the F-14, can we? Because this is where things are getting interesting, because the British are going through deck cruiser Sea Harrier, which works fantastically when we get to Falklands, which we'll talk about in a bit. But the US are going for this next generation, very high performance set of aircraft, with Tomcat being the lead. Plus, you've got things like in the 60s as well, the Vigilante, which is possibly one of the most beautiful naval aircraft ever.
Yeah, I agree.
But you've got this sort of weird wonderfulness coming through on the US side of just highly capable aircraft that are populating these new supercarriers.
Well, I'd argue we could go back to the 60s and say we mentioned the Vigilante, but things like the Phantom, which came into the early 60s, the A6 Intruder again, and both those aircraft were absolutely magnificent and high performance, and carried on pretty much, in the case of the Phantom, to the end of the Cold War, in the case of the Intruder very much to the end of it, through being upgraded, because they were incredibly capable airframes that could accept upgrades and
good old Grumman.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, well, oh my God, this is the case of the Phantom. But you're right. Yes, and to extend the Skyhawk, although that was later replaced by, I guess, F-18 when you go on to that. But you're right. In the 70s we get into to F-14, later F-18, very very capable aircraft. And in case of F-14, it's F-14/Phoenix, really. It's a game changer that you've got this very massive long-range airplane with a massive long-range stick, so you can take out things like Bear and Badger before they even get close to the carrier group. So that's the idea, that you can actually put these things way out and defend the carrier group that way, while the other airplanes in the group, helicopters particularly, and S-3 Viking, which again is another fantastic anti-submarine warfare aircraft, do the business for to chase off the submarines.
How has the Soviet approach changed? Because the capability is increasing by factors of a big number. Just pick one.
It changes in a way, because from the mid-50s that they were, having changed from the focus on the sea lines of communication, where they're into, right, we want to get rid of the carrier groups, and now we're thinking, actually, do you know what? The important thing is strategic nuclear warfare, and what we're going to do is we're going to concentrate on finding the US and British boomers, their ballistic missile subs, and also we're going to put out our own ballistic missile subs. So suddenly they now take a bit of an interest in anti-submarine warfare, which they really hadn't done previously very much. I mentioned helicopters, so suddenly helicopters come in, but then we get Bear F, which is the actually dedicated anti-submarine warfare. To get the Aviation May, which again sort of four classic sort of P3 type thing again, which is designed to hunt down submarines. So, although that's said, I don't think we're as numerous or as effective as the NATO ones have been. So the Soviets are very much still relying on helicopters from ships, and also their hunter-killer subs. But that again, their strategy has changed again, and now we're not too worried about the carrier groups. We're more interested in getting rid of the ballistic missile submarines. But yes, we're certainly looking at attacking. How do you attack a carrier group? And again, has a sort of very very Soviet thing, is that the Navy fly these airplanes, the Badgers and Bears, to locate targets. But actually, if you then want to take out a carrier group, you have to ring up the Air Force and then they decide whether they're going to do it or not. So they then launch. But they reckon that 3 whole regiments would be needed to take out a single US Navy carrier. So you'd send 3 regiments of badgers with missile carrying badgers and electronic warfare staff and all the rest of it. In the knowledge, you're probably going to lose half of them, or perhaps 2/3 of them.
I'm going to put you on the spot. How many aircraft are in a regiment?
Probably about 30 odd.
Wow, so we're talking about 90 aircraft strike.
Yeah. Most regiments had sort of three squadrons in them with about sort of 10 to 12 aircraft. Although I suppose it might have been the third squadron might have been training squadron, but it's only at least 2. That's 20 aircraft. So going through those, we've talked about 60 aircraft. And I guess if you scrub together the other reserve training squadrons, that you've got your numbers up there. So it's a lot of airplanes. And the idea is that you just shove them all through, and that you overwhelm the defences. That the Tomcat can carry 6 Phoenix. So that takes 6 of them out, and the rest of them will, so as long as one gets through and scores a hit, then you've done the job. But again, that was the kind of the slight, I suppose, change in the way they do it. But basically, very much the same sort of airplanes. Although, again, we get into the Forger. They think, yes, we will go into aircraft carriers now. So in the 70s. Well, actually, before that, we get into carriers like the helicopter carrier Moskva, which could carry helicopters on it, but again, couldn't carry that many really, but could carry some. And from there, we get into the sort of the through-deck cruiser type thing with Kiev, which was the only one to say. The other 2, Minsk and Novorossiysk, were both actually operated in the Pacific. So Kiev's the only one that operates and that's actually mainly in the Med, with these Forgers, which are actually pretty much chocolate teapots. Really, they don't have a look-down, shoot-down radar. They're very, very short range. They're very, very difficult to fly. So they're not particularly effective war machines. They're more of a sort of symbolic thing, I think.
I need to do a dedicated episode on the Forger, because it's one of those aircraft that on paper you can kind of go, yeah, that might work, but just the lack of lateral thinking that you get with Harrier, for example, as well. It's a big zero of an aircraft.
Yeah, they did actually try them out in Afghanistan. They sent a squadron out there to have a go, and they decided it didn't work at all. But again, it wasn't a very well, it's about lateral thing, but lateral stability was another big problem with it. Hovering that. So I think it was a nightmare to fly. And again, it didn't. I don't know what it carried in terms of weapons. Not a lot, with not a lot of range, and a very sort of basic radar on it. So it was really not a whole bunch of use, really.
When we get into the 80s, because dear viewer and listener, we did say this was going to be a whistle-stop tour through about 50 years of things. This is a fascinating period because you have massive build-up again in the United States under Reagan.
Yeah. Massive
financial issues in the Soviet Union to try to keep up and balance this out. And there's lots of, I'm going to say little, and I don't mean that in any derogatory way, little nasty conflicts along the way. You have Falklands, which proves the through-deck Harrier combination can be effective in the right conflict. But then you also have the new version of gunboat diplomacy when you park a super carrier off the coast of Libya and carry out punitive strikes and things like that. How does the 80s start showing us what we see today as modern force projection?
I think you're right. It does, doesn't it? Because it was so far away from the core NATO defending the North Atlantic, defending sea ice communication, defending from submarines, reinforcing the northern flank, all those things. And suddenly came to nothing really. I mean, the Falklands again was a completely different war that neither the carriers really nor the aircraft had practiced for or were expecting. I think what it proves actually is that I suppose we Brits are very good at kind of making things up on the hoof, but how good the training, and I'll say it was NATO wide, how good NATO training was in terms of generating individuality and flexibility and the ability to think laterally, to think outside the box and to get a job done, which kind of wasn't really what the Russians and the Soviets and Warsaw Pact were particularly well known for. And so I think that was kind of their big limitation through it. But yes, you're right. I mean, the Libyan stuff shows exactly what we've ended up with really, and you can look into Iraq, Afghanistan, and all of those and see similarities, shall we say, or that perhaps that was the thin end of the wedge that eventually ended up with sort of those other conflicts in the Middle East and Asia.
The 80s are sort of probably the high watermark for the this is a technical term, the amount of stuff that's at sea, isn't it? It's the number of American carriers. You have the two British ones. The French have Foch at this time as well, which is Foch, and then I'm trying to think of the other one. Anyways, but
de Gaulle, I think, I can't remember if de Gaulle was around at that stage. Probably,
I think,
I can't remember at all.
Yes, any French listeners, we do apologise, because the French are flying some very, very pretty aircraft off of that aircraft. Yeah. Dassault know how to design a very good looking jet. I should be putting some pictures of French aircraft flying off of.
Well, it was a beautiful machine, I think.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Of course, they also did fly the Crusader. The F8 Crusader was sort of advanced until but
another
main strike aircraft, very, very pretty machine.
Yeah,
and capable as well, very capable machine.
100%. Yeah. So, as we're saying, so this high watermark, what do we see? Do we see a drawing back of these sort of almost knocking on the door operations by the Russians, or does it sort of ramp up until 89 when everything goes terribly wrong for them, and not in a military sense? Well, in a military sense, but not. It is a military sense that brings it all down.
Much, it did carry on at full pelt, and particularly their ballistic missile subs that started this business, which I found odd enough. I saw something that was published a couple of days ago. Say, this new Soviet thing, they're going to talk about the bastion in the Atlantic, but they'd already come up with that plan, and so this was now the new challenge that rather than operating closer to home, suddenly NATO maritime patrol aircraft will have to leg it out into the North Arctic Ocean to track down the submarines. Which, of course, they did. They were very, very good at doing all of those things. As I mentioned earlier on, pretty much every submarine that came out of Murmansk had people following it wherever it went. So I think the pressure stayed there pretty much towards the end. And as you say, more money was being, America was spending a lot of money. We were spending a lot of money as well. And I think that the Invincible class carriers, were relative. Well, they were new builds, weren't they? They came out in the early 70s. We were still throwing money at the problem, but throwing money actually really effectively, both in terms of equipment, in terms of the backup that we need, in terms of supplies and wherewithal, and in terms particularly, and again I go back to my comments about the Falklands, in terms of the training that carried on through these massive exercises, where we demonstrated and practiced working together and being effective. So I think it carried on right up to the end. And again, this is where with carrier groups now sort of found themselves becoming vulnerable as they got closer to Norway, and so we're now into, well, let's see if we can hide the carriers in the fields and sort of operating from again a different mode of operation, really, where you stick the carrier in a field and operate it out of that to avoid particularly backfire, which had come into service by then and was a very much more capable airplane than the Badger and to an extent Bear that it was replacing the strike role. So that was kind of the next generation, really, was how do we defend against aircraft like backfire? Fencer as well was another one which was causing headaches, although I don't think it was actually used in the maritime role, but they were frightened that it would be. So development of tactics, but following the same strategy, really, and right up to the end. And then it all went horribly wrong.
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting way just to segue to sort of looping back round, really, is thankfully no confrontation, but training coming close to incidents more than once throughout this period as well. Today is interesting because you have a lot of rhetoric coming from Russia, but again, they're embroiled in a land war. We now have the Chinese building Fujian, things like that. Is this sort of NATO stress point now that we've had, that that we don't have as many big exercises as we did when I were a lad and when you were strapping tornadoes to your back? It's an interesting time. And has that sort of end of history thing meant that lessons are going to have to be relearnt, and that force projection thing is going to be having to look further to the Pacific than perhaps the Atlantic, that the North Atlantic Treaty Organization was designed to protect.
Yeah, I think in terms of the Pacific threat, I think that's something different. Again, that's very much a kind of American, I say, problem. Obviously, we have committed to help and all the rest of it, but our focus really has to be the Atlantic. And again, bearing in mind, I wrote this book sort of 2 years ago, and it's taken that time to come through and get published and everything else. I'm particularly proud of the last chapter of the kind of review, where I've said, well, what happened after? And actually, what happened after is we massively took our eye off the ball. Thought, oh, that's it. The Russians have gone home, and again, to an extent, they did. In that, there were all these photographs of these rusting hulks up in Murmansk, and the submarine force sort of fell apart. But we took that as thanks, we don't need to bother with that anymore. And so this massive amount of expertise that we had in terms of tracking submarines, as I've kind of alluded to already, suddenly sort of evaporated. And we, the Brits, are particularly to blame, because we had binned them roll completely, and stepped out of the then submarine warfare game for about 10 odd years, perhaps longer. Again, I haven't counted it out. But and there are a number of problems, and one of them is, of course, again, which I do mention in the book, is that there was the North American spy ring who sold the construction secrets of submarine propellers to the Soviets, and I think it was a Japanese company that then sold the Norwegian-designed milling equipment that allowed you to mill these shapes. And so suddenly handed to them on plate was how to build a submarine that nobody can hear. So that coincided with at the same time as our anti-submarine warfare role shrinking down, a massive loss of practice. If you think that every time maritime patrol aircraft went out in the Cold War, the crew were doing their wartime job. They were locating submarines and tracking them, and going to actually practicing attacks on them, but actually physically finding them and tracking them. And that's why they were so good at it, because they had daily practice at it. Of course, once you take that away, you've then got to get that practice back and those skills back again, which you've lost. At the same time, it's much more difficult, because the submarines are better designed and more difficult to find at a time when you have less skills, but also you have less money. And that's important, because it's a very, very expensive job, tracking submarines. You'll lob all these sonar buoys out, which cost a shitload of money. So, whereas before you might lob out, let's say 10, figure I've just plucked from there. So, don't take it as gospel. That 10 to find an old school submarine. Now, you're probably going to have to lob out 20, but you probably haven't got 20, because the money isn't there, hasn't been there to buy it, so you're not stocked, so you don't have the spare parts and all the rest of it. So that's a really, really big problem. Is everything coming together? It's a perfect storm almost of a lack of practice, of lack of resource, and of going against something which is in the time then you've lost your skills has gained theirs considerably. It's a sort of massive crossover. So the balance of power has very much swung the other way, having been really with NATO for throughout the Cold War, so 40 years worth. There's suddenly in the last 20 just gone swing back again the other way. And again, it's interesting things like the spy ships that are apparently trolling around the British waters at the moment, which again I alluded to in the book about how this whole business of subsurface warfare, and how if you don't keep track of it, if you don't keep your eye on the ball, then you can't. They don't know where it's gone. They don't know what it's done. These sort of telephone wires and things in the Baltic getting cut, and gas pipelines and all the rest of it, and God knows what else has had demolition charges put on it. Who knows? Because we massively took our eye off the ball and didn't follow it up. Then we move on. Sorry to carry on now.
Go for it.
We're talking airplanes. The bit that's always sad to say, actually, as a pilot, which is the rise of the drone. And suddenly, for maritime patrol, for just trotting around, keeping an eye on things, surveillance, why use a manned aircraft when you can lob a drone up that might stay up there? Particularly these sort of big, the big jet powered ones that can stay up for 24 hours, 36 hours, can go fast, can cover a load of ground with sensors that you can look at remotely. So that suddenly has a place in it. But of course, what that means is that you can then concentrate the manned element on the more complex things, such as hunting down submarines. So, there's a pro there, and also things like the Navy looking at, or US Navy, I think our Navy perhaps as well, we'll have to, I think, is looking at air-to-air refueling drones. So do you need to, in the days where you put up an A6 intruder, that means you've lost an A6 from the strike role, so it's now a tanker. I know they're using the F-18 now for that as well. But again, you've now lost a very capable strike aircraft and using it as a tanker, which probably doesn't really need all that kit on it. So again, a much more efficient way of doing so. So that's quite an exciting way to look. And again, as I was looking at it, thinking, well, to be honest, with the way the Russians have gone with their long-range maritime patrol aircraft, the Soviet Naval Air Force, the AVMF, probably, I would say, its days are numbered, because why would you need manned aircraft to do the jobs they do? Because they can be done very efficiently, and particularly in places, at the north, the Arctic, where perhaps you don't want people to be necessarily. So yeah, that's the change really of how we've taken off our eye off the ball, how there are other opportunities there, but how other people have taken opportunities to get ahead of us.
Well, that's a cheery way to wrap this up, isn't it? Yeah. There's easy jokes to be made about the Kutuzov carrier being on fire and things like that, but that's not really the threat, is it?
No, I think it's always been a bit of a red herring, and they, the flankers that they put on it again didn't really work, and I think they lost a couple of them. So I think they only ever built about 12 of them. They've lost one at least, so there's probably only 10 of them that work, and they're probably somewhere else doing other things. So again, I think it was never really a massive threat. Again, it's one of those sort of politically symbolic things that you can sail it down the English Channel, pumping loads of black smoke out of it. But it did. I don't think it ever had a particular capability as such in the way that other Soviet vessels definitely did have.
Just to say, the book is great. The imagery in all your books is fantastic. And yes, I pointedly didn't mention the A6 because that would lead me down a massive rabbit hole, as just thinking of the amount of times I read Flight of the Intruder as a teenager.
Yes, I've got it on my shelves up here actually.
My uncle used to fly down to Oshkosh with Stephen Coons, and so when he passed, my aunt gave all the signed copies away to someone, and when I said, "Can I have those?" because I've got the paperback my uncle gave me, she went, "Oh, I've already given them away." So yes. My auntie Ursula, I did remind her that I was cross.
I'm going to get my copy up here. Yeah. There we go. That's my copy of it, and indeed at the beginning, all enough, I've put my name on it, but as you can see, it was actually bought on red flag at Smith and Space, October 1987, and I have read it a good few times, and what a wonderful book it is. And I did actually write Steve Kutuz actually, and congratulate him, and got a nice name back for him.
Oh, lovely. I've seen him interviewed. He seems a lovely chap. One of these days, I'll work up the courage to reach out, but he keeps popping up on Ward Carroll's channel, and they know each other for two, but just let them do their thing. Mike, thank you so much for this. The book is just over your shoulder. Give us the whole title. Go on.
Yeah, it's Over Cold War Seas. It's NATO and but I read it. NATO and Soviet Naval Aviation. Yeah, that's it. Right. There we go. Mine's back to front by the look of it. It was a bit of a shame, but
it's just the way the camera picks it up. It's all good. It'll flip around for that. And many thanks to Elle at Osprey for sending me this copy, which is very, very kind of her. Yeah.
She's done a great job, actually, hasn't she?
Yeah, 100%. So I'll get this on the record. We need to go find a nice GR Tornado that you can take us around and tell us some stories. So if you don't mind, I will hold you to that.
Yeah.
Because there's, if I move this to one side, there's another one of your books.
Oh, that's on as well.
All about you doing things in the desert in powder pink Tonkas. So we'll do that. Thank you so much, and it's good to see you again after so long.
Yeah, likewise, Matt. Really good to talk to you, and always a pleasure, as I say.
Splendid. I cannot thank Michael Napier enough for joining us on the Aviation Show. Over Cold War Seas, NATO and Soviet Naval Aviation, 1949 to 1989, is available now from Osprey, and there are affiliate links to our bookshop.org sites here in the UK and the US if you want to grab a copy of Mike's book while supporting him, independent bookshops, and the show as well, which would be lovely. If you fancy getting these episodes early without any ads and hearing a little bit more from me about what's going on and what we have planned, please do join us on Patreon, which starts from just £3 a month plus a bit of VAT. And you'll be able to see some of the fun stuff we have coming up this year in 2026, where we're going to be getting out and about to see some incredible aircraft throughout the UK, Europe, and elsewhere, which I can't wait to tell everybody about what we have lined up in the summer. So until next time, thank you so much for joining us, and until next time, take care of yourselves. Bye-bye. I'd like to say thanks to all of our fantastic supporters over on Patreon. If you head over to our Patreon page, you can join the fun from just £3 a month plus a bit of VAT, get your name in these very credits, and get all of the episodes ad-free and early as soon as I get the edit finished. The Aviation Show is hosted and produced by Matt Bone and is a Boney Abroad production.